purpose in kind of an interjection there in the middle of it, that helps to make sense of these things in this world. And then the vanity of labor. Small interlude, the first 7 verses of chapter 5, about the approach of God in reverent fear, that we need to approach Him correctly. It's not just like He is a human on the same level with us. We need to have a respect and a reverence for God as we should. And then we'll finish out with that. Really been looked at already, but it'll come back. Go into the words of wisdom as we know. Let's get started with chapter 5, looking at the first 5 verses starting out. Walk prudently when you go to the house of God, and draw near to hear rather than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they do evil. Do not be rash with your mouth, and let not your heart utter anything hastily before God. For God is in heaven, and you on earth. Therefore let your words be few. For a dream comes through much activity, and a fool's voice is known by his many words. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it, for He has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. Better not to vow than to vow and not pay. All right. Let's look at that statement there at the first, and you might also look at questions number 1 and 2. We're going to get to those here from chapter 5 with these first few verses. When you see the admonition given to walk prudently when you come before God or in the house of God, what's meant by that? Well, it needs to be turned on. All right. What do we know about walking prudently before God in worship? What'd be the opposite of that? Okay, a flippancy, a kind of without wisdom, and without wisdom would not regard God for who He is, right? So he says, if I'm going to do that prudently, how do I approach God? Here, as it says, the house of God, under the old law. How would I do that? Okay. During this time, when they were under the old law, they talked about the house of God. What was meant by that? As they went to the temple, right? Why? That's where they had those places of sacrifice and honor, of there being the worship that was given in that sort of way collectively of Judah and Israel to gather to that place. And when they went there, what were they to recognize it as? What had God said about that temple in the dedication of it? Do what? All right. What did He mean by that's where I dwell? Solomon noted, does God live in this place? No, the heaven of heavens cannot contain God, much less this place that we've made for Him. Go ahead.
It reminds me of the burning bush. And,
okay.
Remove your sandals. It's a sacred place because I'm here right now with you.
This is a representative kind of thing where it's pointed out that this showed God's existence with them, His care for them, His keeping of them. God couldn't be contained. That's a very clear case of 1 Kings chapter 8 in that place itself. That's not what was meant that He physically dwells there. But this was a place that represented His presence with them, His blessings with them. And therefore, if they were the ones to make some plea to God, they were to face that house, that temple, and pray for the blessings of God, because it was that which characterized the fact He had a special relationship with Israel. Now, as that, when He says you go prudently, there, rather than giving the sacrifice of fools, what would, under the old law, what would the sacrifice of fools be in coming to so-called worship God, but it actually be a sacrifice of fools? Go ahead, Larry.
I'd say if you do it in a way that he hasn't prescribed.
Okay. If I did that in such a way as I had no concern towards God, what else? Go ahead.
Bringing an animal or some type of sacrifice that was substandard and not up to, not the best.
Okay. When you look at it, there's a principle that is illustrated in the Old Testament, stated by Jesus very clearly in the New Testament in John 4. We worship God in spirit and in truth. We worship Him with the right reverent kind of behavior that recognizes His greatness and our smallness in that we go before Him with godly fear, and that we do that which is according to truth, what He has prescribed. Now, to do either one of those, I'm doing those things that are, or to do the opposite of either one of those, I'm doing that which is not prudent before God, because it goes against His will. It's the sacrifice of fools. Now, how did God take that? When Nadab and Abihu decided to offer a strange fire, what did God do? Consume them. Why? All right. All right. How do you know they didn't show respect? Okay, God said you offer this kind of fire. Fire from off of the brazen altar was where that fire was to be taken for the burning of incense. They did not take it there. If I do not do what God says to do, then what have I done? I've acted in a way that's irreverent before God. The point is not, well, as long as you have the right attitude toward it, you can do the wrong thing. I hear that a lot these days, and I hear it in the denominational world, that somehow you can do the wrong thing. In other words, you can do something that isn't commanded, but as long as your heart intended to do right, then everything's all right. No. What do I need to do before I go to God in worship? I need to find out what His will is. Why do I do that? Because there's a reverence, there's a respect for God that drives me to that. It recognizes it's not just what I want to do. I need to go to God and get His will. If I fail to do that, then I've failed to do the very start of that. It shows no reverence for God. And that's the point that's being here. The sacrifice of fools, the word fool is the one who is empty. In other words, he's empty of the will of God, the law of God, what God had said. So he's going in and offering a sacrifice minus anything that God has had to say about this. Is that the way we would approach God as we should if He is greater than we are? No. You're not going to do that with anybody just in an earthly way. If you're going to try to please your boss or somebody else, you're going to find out what his desires are first. And if you don't do that, it doesn't show any respect at all. Go ahead.
It's like Samuel told Saul, it's better to obey than to sacrifice.
That's right. That's right.
Obey what God told him to do.
Not everything will do religiously. And that's the point that he says, do not be rash with your mouth in that second verse. And let not your heart utter anything hastily before God. Why? What's the next phrase? God's where? And you're where? You're on the earth. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways than your ways, my thoughts than your thoughts. That's the reference there. You look at the place that God is and the place that man is, and you see that reference of who is higher. God is, in that sense, not just physically or something higher. I'm talking about He's one who is of a greater realm. He's one who is unlike man. He is all by Himself. That's the whole point when it talks about the Lord our God, the Lord is one. He's unique. Nobody is like him. You had something.
Yeah, I think part of it, when we're getting to it too, is in that first sentence there, it says, when you go, draw near to hear. And then it talks about you talking too much. You need to be listening and finding out, not so much speaking of everything, just like you're saying, but it says draw near to hear rather than.
When they came to the temple, what was to happen when they came to the temple together to worship? In each of the times that you have a prescribed time of them coming before, something takes place in every case. What is it? The reading of the law. That was the thing that took place, whatever we're dealing with. On the Passover feast was to be partaken in the families. And as they partook of that feast, they first went over and said, this is the Lord's Passover. And they went back over what took place. When they came up out of Egypt and the firstborn was taken, wherever there was not the blood on the doorpost. And so you go through that every time. And you find that there was to be a sacred assembly once a year in which all of the law was to be read. Now, why does he say then, you be ones who recognize the need not to speak, but to be quiet? Why are we looking at that? Because that's the attitude that God expects. It's not something that we're the ones to just tell God what we think we ought to do, and we just blurt it out. Had a time I was a moderator for another brother who was debating a Pentecostal, and we pointed out that these Pentecostals were going into their so-called tongues, which was nothing but gibberish, and other things are there, and pointed out, this is directly in violation of what the Scripture talks about, 1 Corinthians chapter 12 to 14. How can you say you're doing the will of God there? He says, well, I'd rather be doing something wrong than nothing at all. And this is a passage I immediately thought of when that was there. And you see that kind of a thing said repeatedly in the religious world. That somehow the idea is whatever I want to offer to God, God ought to be pleased with that. When instead, what ought it to be? Yeah. I better be quiet and figure out what God wants and then start to act in that way. What do you notice about that in the religious world? Have you seen this kind of be the thing that you see not being heeded in many ways? Like I said, you look in the Pentecostal world, it's obvious. I've never gone to a Pentecostal service that abided by everything that was said in 1 Corinthians 12 through 14. I mean, most often it's a one violation after another of that. I've been to a number of them. What else do you see? When you look at the mega churches and their TV evangelism and all of that, is this the kind of approach that you see? This way for yes, this way for no. What do you think?
A lot of it's sort of, I'm okay, you're okay.
Okay.
Whatever makes me happy and what I get out of the service.
All right.
They always tell people to do some good instead of do what's right, kind of thing.
All right.
They go around and tell everyone, like, if you pray, your life will change, I promise, give it 15 days, instead of, hey, follow the word of God, actually.
Okay. What else do you see? Go ahead.
Let your words be few, to me, suggests that too many of us want to tell people what we think instead of what God said.
Exactly. The idea is you make sure of what you're saying first, not just blurt it out. And that's true among us as well. The statements that are there, we need to be very careful. I was preaching back in Missouri at one time when I was doing my graduate work, and it was with a congregation I didn't know until toward the end of my year with them that They had come out of, and not very far out, of a kind of a, I don't know what you'd say, a mutual edification is the name that is used. The idea was that each male member needed to say something in every service, or every day at least, Sunday, either Sunday morning or Sunday night. You needed to say something in order to edify the others. And you would almost get it. You'd start to dismiss on a Wednesday or a Sunday, and somebody would think, uh-oh, hadn't said anything, and they'd say something, and it was more often than not inane than anything really edifying. But the concept was, I need to say something there. No, what I need to do is be careful that what my statement is true to the book, is true to the will of God, that it's that which is according to His truth. I went to a denominational service one time, and the guy, after he got through, actually said, this is not made up, this is truth is stranger than fiction category. Guy got up and said, well, I didn't have time to look at my lesson very much tonight. I just kind of let the Spirit move me. Tomorrow night I'm going to try to do better. And I thought, now isn't that interesting? He was letting the Spirit move him, and he was going to try to study himself and do better next time. The Spirit doesn't move us to do those things, obviously. That's what it did to those who were revealing the truth in the first century. But the idea of the necessity of looking at what the Spirit has revealed, that's something that is a must before we're going to be capable of teaching. Be not many of you teachers have said for a reason. And that is that just adding something in rather than that being right is not a good concept. Anybody? Go ahead.
Well, in this context, even in our talking to God, even in our prayers, when He wants us to come and pray, our attitude should be more like the publican who had very little to say, and the Pharisee who had a lot to say about himself. And what our motivation is, what are we coming to God for? Is it to make me feel better, or am I coming to be in a relationship with God, to be obedient to God, and to be in accordance with His will? And it's every word out of my mouth, it's every action that I take, whether I'm walking into worship with Him or in my quiet prayers on my own. When I'm talking to God, I need to be listening more than
That's right. Recognizing what His truth is and asking that according to His will, and not my will but thine be done, the kind of concept that's there. That there needs to be a recognition of our responsibility to go to God and ask Him for the things that are needed. Go ahead, Bo.
These first two verses almost fit perfectly with Elijah and the contest on Mount Carmel, the false prophets, and all the crazy stuff they were doing and going on, and then Elijah basically said one prayer.
Exactly.
Short prayer. And
Called on God for the action that was there. Anything else? Okay, when he talks about the idea of when you vow, you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it. That's the idea, the word that's used there, delay, of procrastinate. Don't wait. It's not, don't tarry a long time. It's don't tarry at all. Don't be swift instead to pay that vow when you paid it. For He has no pleasure in fools. What does that mean? If I'm vowing something, hadn't thought about it, and I end up not being able to do that, what does that make me? I'm a fool for having done that, not considered how this is going to be done. And he says it's better not to vow at all than to vow and not pay. Vow and not do what you said. That is a part of one who is going to keep his word to others, to consider a promise before it's made. But how much more would that be necessary with God? Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount talks about the fact, let your yea be yea, let your nay be nay. In other words, your yes and no are a binding thing. That you don't have to take an oath with that. That's just as binding as any oath that you took. Your word is that bond. And here, especially before God, we need to remember those things. So that idea that I better be very sure that when I'm going to do something and have promised to God, that I've got the way to do that, and it's not something that I delay and say, well, I'll take care of that later on. That needs to be swift. That needs to be something that I give very quick attention to. All right, anything else there in this section? Okay, verse 6 and 7. Do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, nor say before the messenger of God that it was an error. Why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? For in the multitude of dreams and many words, there is also vanity, but fear God. What do you see there again? The problem with what? Multitude of what? Okay. We made that emphasis again there to point out the fact that it is something in doing that. Do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin. How could that be done? How could my mouth cause my flesh to sin? Go ahead.
Uttering a rash vow.
Okay. That's one.
Talk yourself into a corner.
Okay.
Lots of ways. Say that you can do something and then you try and back it up, but you can't. Get yourself in all kinds of trouble trying to follow what your mouth is.
It's not only like the rash vow of Abimelech. It's also that you have a statement that's made. If I come out and I make a statement before thinking Scripture through, and let's say I'm one who has made a mistake there, hadn't thought about that, I state something wrong, what's the tendency of people to do after they've said something like that? Okay. It's either not what I meant or what? Defend it. I've talked with people who have defended statements they've made that if you would have talked to them 2 hours before, there's no way they would have defended that statement. But they didn't think about it, and they said it, and now there's the defense of this. We need to understand that when we think about something and start to say it, we need to pull that back in and think about it some more. Think about it not only at that point, but what does that lead to? And what does that lead to? And what does that lead to? And if it's going to end up in a place of wrong, what should we do with the first thought of that? Dismiss that one. Let's go somewhere else. And that's something that I see happens many times with preachers. One of the things we talk about in the preacher training program is when you have one of those brilliant ideas that comes to your mind, you know, as you're up there preaching, you hadn't thought about it when you were studying, but you thought, wow, that was great. Don't say it. Don't say that one. Because chances are it's not all that great. And think about it for a while before you get up there. Think on that one. Say it next time if you need to, but not right now. That kind of point of saying it off the cuff and talking like that, or getting something that's to be arranged just on the spur of the moment, not a good way to be involved in teaching. We need to think things through, not only with what's said, but the effect of those. Aaron, you had something.
Yeah, Harry, I think for me to make a long comment short, when we do not walk in a way that these scriptures have suggested us walk or commanded us to walk, or if we walk in ways that it says not to walk, the big picture, what we're doing, we're just as guilty as just the plethora of denominations out there that are leading millions upon millions of people to eternal separation. I mean, because if we're the light of the world as Christians, and when we're doing contrary to the way this is teaching us to walk, we're just as guilty as another denominational group spreading false doctrine, or at least, giving out the wrong idea.
God's people need to be those who are unique. The There's one church that Jesus built, and he is the leader of that. He's the king, and we need to listen to him in all that's said. He would build his church. He has the right to command it. And so we need to think about that. At this time, as the Jews were there, they had a law. They needed to go to that law. And that law needed to be on their heart and on their mind, as Deuteronomy had pointed out. And then they would do according to what God had said. When they turned from that, had their own thoughts in mind, they had a problem. He says, for in the multitude of dreams and many words, there's also vanity. How many times have you heard, if you watched much on the TV evangelists or the mega churches, that they talk about a dream that they had, how I dreamed this or that? I've heard that repeatedly. Where'd you see that one time in Scripture? You remember when we were studying a book in the Old Testament? Do what? Okay. Well, Daniel had his dreams from God, but I mean in the multitude of dreams, people say, and ended up in trouble. Book of Job, I think of. You have several in the book of Job that point out. Elihu was one of them as the youngest, and various others that you find there who had a dream. I heard in a dream that this is what you did. And they charged they charged Job with sin. And that's how they knew, because it came to them in a dream at night. When somebody has a revelation that comes to them directly in a dream, watch out. God's revelation is always from God. It may be through dreams, but then what happens to it? It's confirmed by signs that are given from God. And so when we have something that's just from a person dreaming it up, or I thought of this, pull that back in. That is not the kind of thing we need to base our thoughts and our teaching on. We need to come back to the will of God. Go ahead, James.
Makes me think of Muhammad with
That's exactly right.
That was what he was doing, is he was taking his dreams and writing down stones and bones,
Yeah.
walls and whatever.
Or telling them to people. Actually, there's nothing known to have been written down by Muhammad at all.
They later said that it was
Yeah.
written down on stones.
Yeah. Anything else? Go ahead.
I remember several years ago, somebody interviewed Oral Roberts, and he claimed to be, receiving revelation from God. And they asked him, what is it like? What does it sound like? He said, well, it's like a ringing in my ear. I hear this ringing right here. And then I know it's from God.
Yeah. You can look in the Book of Mormon, and you'll see similar statements about what Joseph Smith said, various ones of the kind of so-called revelations that came to them that were anything but clear. And most of the time, both Joseph Smith and Muhammad said that they weren't sure whether it was from God or the devil in some of what they said. Well, there's a big difference in that and what you see in the New Testament and in the Old Testament as well. All right, verse 8. If you see the oppression of the poor and the violent perversion of justice and righteousness in a province, do not marvel at the matter, for high officials watches over high official, and higher officials are over them. Moreover, the profit of the land is for all, even the king is served from the field. Now that first part, the first 7 verses we've been talking about, is that interlude where it encourages reverence and thought before God. Now we're back into the point about the vanity of riches, the vanity of things in this world, in the material realm. And the first thing he says is, you see the oppression of the poor. How does the oppression of the poor happen? Who has the power to oppress the poor?
Perversion of power.
All right. Perversion of power, those who are supposed to address justice do not. They pervert it in their own way. This is repeatedly pointed out in the Old Testament, in the books of history, with regard to what those who were leaders did. They robbed the widows. They robbed those who were without the the power. The poverty that was there was something that was exacerbated because they took even what they had for themselves. And that's a point of what you see again and again stressed. He says, now when you see that, he says the perversion, the violent perversion of justice and righteousness in the province, what do you do with that? You say, wow, that's amazing. I never saw that before. What do you notice?
You shouldn't be surprised because it's always happened.
Okay. I was asked one time when I was over in the Philippines, their government has, I don't know, they've reached a new high in anything I've seen about perverting things and robbing people. One of their presidential candidates one time said that there's one president, when it was him, I think he was named Marcos, that the corruption was under the table. And then now he says it has been at this last president that it was over the table. And with the present president, he took the table. And I think that was about it. You know, there's a progression that you see, the perversion of justice taking place there. I got a question one time, well, when did this start? And I said, well, when's the first government you can think of? That's about the first time I know of it having happened. That's not something that's unusual. It's going to happen. Does that mean I like it? No. But why is that always going to be present? Okay, do what? Men are involved, the devil's behind it, there's a desire for evil.
Selfish ambition.
Okay.
Cover your backside.
I mean, a lot of times you hear somebody say, well, this fella, this president or whatever, good intentions, he'll sacrifice to do what's right for the country or good for the country. Hate to burst your bubble. But the fact of it is, when you got somebody that's going to be elected by spending $100 million to get a $300,000 a year salary, my idea is probably not benevolence is what's behind that. There's somewhere else that you're going to get some money out of that, or you're going to get some power or something else. How is it that you see these people who are in places of power, and by and large, I'm not saying in every case, but by and large, they're far wealthier when they get out of it than when they went into it. That's not benevolent attitudes typically, and that's typical not only of our country, that's there of every country I know about, and it was true in Bible times as well. There was a perversion of justice. You had a high official who watches over a high official. Now, why is that brought up? There's supposedly checks and balances.
Every level has their hands in the till.
Okay.
So you've got the fox guarding the hen.
Okay. So if this one's going to get by with stealing, how's he going to do it? Usually by paying off the guy that watches over him. The checks and balances mean that the checks go out and the balances grow higher, is what takes place in most cases. And here you have who's over them, higher officials still. And what happens? That corruption goes on and on and on. And we ought not to be amazed about that. Moreover, he says, the profit of the land is for all. In other words, what's intended from the things of the fruits of the field, everything that's there, it's for all. Poor and those who are higher in power, all. Why? Because they got all eat. Those things are there, but what's going to happen? What's going to happen is the perversion of the dealing out of that is going to be something that takes place. Even the king, he says, is served from the field. That, I think, is a reference back to the Old Testament law, where first Samuel was supposed to tell the people in 1 Samuel when they wanted a king, what that king was going to be like. And what you did to do that is go back into the Old Testament law, because the Old Testament law told them what a king was like, what's supposed to be there. And it gave the taxes that were to be given to a king, and they were exorbitant. And that's something that you're going to find. Anytime you have one like that, they're going to be fed. Others are going to have less because they demand a high portion of all of that. That's the point that it seems to me Solomon's making is this is what's said in the law, even is the point that all are served from the field. Anybody else? Next part, verse 10. He who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. This also is vanity. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. So what profit have the owners except to see them with their eyes? The sleep of the laboring man is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep. Why does the increase never satisfy someone who's involved in materialism or greed? Do what? Okay. When you get one thing, then it becomes old and there's something else down the line. Have you ever seen a rich person that admitted being rich? I've only seen one in my whole life, and that was rather recently. But I've never seen him admit to being rich. Why? Okay. I had a guy who told me, "Oh no, this company is so alone, it's worth $48 million, but I'm not rich." I had to scratch my head on that one for a minute. Why? Look at that guy over there. The rich people have ones that are hundreds of millions of dollars. And then the hundreds of millions of dollar people, what do they say? I'm not rich. They're billionaires out there. And the billionaires can now look at places like Apple, I guess, and say, man, there are trillionaires out there, so I'm not rich. You always think of that with somebody else. To somebody, I'm rich and you're rich. And there's always somebody that is above me that I'll look at as being rich. But I fail to see those principles toward myself. When you look in the New Testament, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, right? Didn't say money is. Why does it say the love of that? Okay. And what's the attitude of the one who has a love of money? Do what? Okay. It's priority, and he wants what? More and more of it. And the idea is I amass that to myself. Don't spend it. I've got to get more and more and more and accumulate all of it. And what good does it do? It does none. And that's what's being described. Go ahead.
Not only the priority, it's the priority of his focus. I mean, that's all he's thinking about.
Yep.
I knew a guy who didn't have a lot of money, but when he got it, he didn't know what to do with it. And he was always miserable and always mad and trying to get more and more and greedy. He wouldn't give anybody a dime.
Yep.
So it's the focus of the priority. That's what the problem is.
What I've noticed is that there can be those without much money at all, and they have a love of money. That's not restricted to people who are rich. That desire for the gain. That when one has enough to pay the bills. You remember when you were just starting out in marriage, if you were poor like we were, you wondered how you're going to pay the electric bill and the rent and everything else all at the same time. It just didn't seem to. And then when you got enough money to pay the rent and all the electric and everything else, then what'd you do? Typically, you probably went out and got someplace better to live, and now you got more of a deal. And it was that kind of thing. Well, there's nothing sinful in and of itself of trying to provide better for a family, but when we're never satisfied with something, and there always has to be that living beyond the means to try and grasp and have everything now. One of the problems with what I see of every generation that comes along more and more is thinking they need to start out where mom and dad are now when they've worked all their life to get there. There needs to be work, hard work, that gets us to where we're going. then we have a value in those things. We recognize that. It's something that is going to be a work ethic that's going to help in that way. When these goods just increase and we look at more and more of a profit and nothing going out, then what happens? Typically, the sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but what happens with the abundance of the rich? Won't permit him to sleep. Why? Okay. Not only worried about getting more, but what else? Somebody's trying to get me. They're trying to rip me off here and doing all of this. I've seen that over and over and over again. And what they thought would bring them peace brought them nothing but misery because they became focused on that. And that was what their life was all about. If we have more blessings, that's good. Use them wisely. Help others as well. What did Ephesians 4 say? Let him that stole steal no more, but what? Work with his hand. There you go. That he might have to share with those who are in need. And that needs to be our idea. When we get to that point, there is that benevolent spirit, that desire to give, and the recognition that that's something that's greater than having for ourselves. All right, anything else there? I'm getting about as far as I thought I would. Okay. There is a severe evil which I have seen under the sun, riches kept for their owner to his hurt. But those riches perish through misfortune. When he begets a son, there is nothing in his hand. As he came from his mother's womb, naked shall he return. To go as he came, and he shall take nothing from his labor which he may carry away in his hand. This also is a severe evil. Just exactly as he came, so shall he go. What profit has he who has labored for the wind? All his days he also eats in darkness, and he has much sorrow and sickness and anger. That's a pretty sad statement of what the facts are going to be, isn't it? A severe evil that he talks about that happens out there under the sun, again, in life, in this world. Riches kept to their owner to his own hurt. What does that mean? How could riches be to someone's own hurt? What do you think? How could they be to someone's own hurt? The riches themselves. So I'm talking about the attitude. Riches to their hurt. Go ahead.
Well, he talks about riches perishing through misfortune. If you have a lot, you can lose a lot. And there's always somebody trying to get it.
Okay.
I could just imagine in those days, if you amassed a lot of, say, a huge crop and lots of grain bins and everything, then you probably have a theft problem all the time. You kind of see that even people that own stores and things. They have to deal with problems that you and I usually don't have to deal with.
Anybody else?
I got a lot of stuff at the house I don't need, but I
Okay.
just keep it and I'll hoard it. Why? Because I like it.
Might look at it once every 7 or 8 years when I move, but that's about it. What else? Go ahead, Gerald.
No U-Hauls behind hearses.
That's right. I've never seen one. When you
Every 2 years.
do what?
Need to move every 2 years.
All right, we throw away a bunch of stuff. Go ahead, Angie.
Well, I think this goes back kind of what we already said in what's in Ephesians and Timothy. It's to his hurt if he's not using it to help others. Scripture all over shows that we benefit when we bless others, and when we don't, it's to our harm. And so if all he's doing is holding it, he's really not any better off, and then he loses it, and all he sees is the loss, and not realizing that he never had all that in the first
That's the point, that all of this became something that he put a lot of time, effort, thought into to amass. Now that he's got it, it was supposedly for an end. But if I'm just going to keep it, then what I have to do, I have to keep on worrying about it and providing for it, making things pull down the barns, build greater, as the rich fool talked about. All of those kind of things are happening. It has a compounding effect. And what ended up being the solution, or what we thought would be the solution to the problem, ended up being another problem all of its own. And that's the idea of these things being kept to their own harm. Now, what typically happens with somebody who is not wise, as they would have those things, then there is a tendency to try to amass more and more. As you have that desire to amass more and more, then you're going to get involved in what? I need to get it quicker and more, so there's going to be a risk that's there typically. That wasn't there at the beginning, and now what happens? Now, it's destroyed. It goes away. And what I have left when the son I beget comes along to be an inheritor? Nothing that's there. We talked about the other case, to where here you provided a lot, now the son comes along and he's a fool and he misuses it. This is not that one. This is what happens to that person who's trying to amass and build this kind of riches and a dynasty, if you will. That what happens in that is he gets his focus on the money and more of that, or the wealth, the riches, the fruits of the field, whatever you want to talk about with material things. And they end up, he wastes that in the sense of being one who uses it in a way that's not wise and ends up without anything. Anybody else got anything on that? Go ahead.
You know, maybe this, I'm just throwing this out here, but it talks about that when those riches perish with misfortune, when he begets the son. What does the misfortune have to do with the son?
With the what? Oh, with the son. Oh.
There's nothing in his hand.
Oh, I think that's the point. He's getting this for a dynasty, and then the son comes along, it's not there anymore because he's lost it through whatever misfortune or...
Before the son wastes it.
Yeah. Well, that's what the case is before, when we made. But I think here is when the son he begets comes to age, there isn't anything there to beget. Or, I mean, anything to inherit. I think this case is distinguished from the other. May not be. It may be a repetition of that. But I think here there's a distinction between that one before and this one. All right. Nothing else, so let's go to God in a word of prayer. Where's Colby? He'll lead us. All right.